February 3, 1945. A hillside compound outside Manila, Philippines. The rain had stopped an hour before dawn, leaving the jungle air thick with the smell of wet bamboo and cordite. Smoke still rose from the Japanese supply depot half a mile down. The valley, where American artillery had found its mark in the darkness. Now, as pale light filtered through the canopy, soldiers from the 37th Infantry Division moved cautiously up a muddy track toward a cluster of wooden buildings that intelligence reports had marked as a logistics station. They expected to find abandoned equipment, perhaps stragglers. Instead, they found 23 women locked in a room with a single barred window, sitting in absolute silence on a floor covered with rice straw and filth. The youngest looked no older than 16. When the door was forced open, none of them screamed. None of them moved. They simply stared at the uniformed men in the doorway with eyes that had learned not to hope. Private First Class Daniel Inouye, a Nisei soldier from Hawaii who would later become a senator, was among the first to enter. He would recall decades later that the silence was more terrible than any sound of battle he had ever heard. It was the silence of women who had been so thoroughly broken that even rescue seemed like another cruel trick. One woman's hands were clenched so tightly that her fingernails had drawn blood from her palms. Another rocked slowly back and forth, her gaze fixed on nothing. A third had wrapped her arms around herself in a posture of permanent defense. These were not the faces of people waiting to be saved. They were the faces of people who had stopped waiting for anything. What the Americans had discovered was one small node in a vast network that stretched across the entire Japanese empire, a system so methodically organized, so carefully documented, so coldly efficient, that its existence would challenge the world's understanding of what industrial-scale atrocity could look like. The women in that room were survivors of what the Imperial Japanese military bureaucratically termed ianjo, comfort stations. The phrase itself was designed to obscure, to soften, to make palatable what was, in truth, a machinery of sexual slavery that had consumed an estimated 200,000 women across Asia and the Pacific. Some had been abducted from village streets in Korea and China. Others had been deceived with promises of factory work or nursing positions. What they all shared was the experience of being reduced from human beings to numbered inventory in a system that treated their bodies as military supplies. The soldiers standing in that doorway in February 1945 did not yet understand the full scope of what they were seeing, but they understood enough. They understood that these women were not soldiers. They understood that whatever had been done to them had been systematic rather than spontaneous. And they understood, in the way that decent men understand such things without need for explanation, that their first obligation was not to interrogate or process or categorize, but simply to help. The comfort women's system did not emerge from chaos or the heat of combat. It was born from cold calculation in the conference rooms of Tokyo, a deliberate policy response to a public relations crisis. In December 1937, during the assault on Nanking, Japanese soldiers had committed mass rapes so widespread and so brutal that even the international community's limited attention was drawn. The atrocities threatened Japan's image as a civilized empire bringing order to Asia. Military command faced a problem: how to maintain soldier morale and provide sexual outlets without generating negative publicity or spreading venereal disease through the ranks. The solution they devised was characteristically bureaucratic. Rather than prohibit sexual violence, which command believed would harm morale, they would institutionalize and regulate it. Beginning in 1938, the military issued directives for the establishment of comfort stations in occupied territories. These were not brothels in the conventional sense, though that is how they were sometimes characterized in post-war apologetics. They were rape centers, operating under military authority, supplied with women through coercion, deception, and outright abduction. The logistics were handled with the same efficiency applied to ammunition supply. A 1939 memorandum from the Army Ministry specified ratios: 1 woman for every 30 enlisted men, 1 for every 20 in frontline positions. Transport was arranged through military channels. Medical inspections were mandatory and frequent, not to protect the women's health, but to prevent disease from reducing combat effectiveness. Women were assigned numbers and Japanese names. Their real identities were systematically erased. In the ledgers and reports that survived the war, they appear as items in inventory lists, alongside rice rations and rifle cartridges. The procurement of women followed established colonial networks. In Korea, which Japan had annexed in 1910, recruiters operated openly, sometimes with the cooperation of local police. They targeted poor families with offers of paid work in Japanese-controlled factories. The contracts they presented looked official, complete with seals and signatures. Most were worthless paper. A woman named Kim Bok-dong, who would later become one of the most prominent survivors to testify publicly, described being recruited at age 14 in 1941. A man in a suit told her she could work in a uniform factory and send money home to her struggling family. She signed papers she could not read. 3 weeks later, she was in a comfort station in Guangdong Province, China, where she was raped by Japanese soldiers for the next 5 years. In China, the Philippines, and Indonesia, the methods were often more brutal. Women were simply taken, pulled from market streets, abducted from farms, seized during military sweeps. Local collaborators were sometimes paid bounties. In some cases, entire villages were rounded up, with young women separated from their families and transported to stations behind the front lines. The Japanese command understood that their use of local populations generated resentment, but the military necessity, as they defined it, outweighed such concerns. The women were expendable. There were always more. By 1942, the system was fully operational across the empire. There were comfort stations in China, Korea, the Philippines, Burma, Indonesia, Malaya, French Indochina, and the Pacific Islands. The largest concentrations were in China and Korea, but virtually every theater of Japanese military operation included these facilities. They ranged from permanent buildings in cities to tent encampments behind mobile units. The women's experiences varied somewhat by location and the disposition of individual officers, but the fundamental reality was universal. They had no freedom, no choice, and no escape. The women served between 10 and 50 men per day, depending on location and military activity. On weekends and after battles, the numbers increased. They were given serial medical examinations, forced inspections conducted by military doctors who treated them as livestock. Those who became pregnant were usually forced to abort, or in some cases, murdered. Those who contracted venereal disease were sometimes treated if medicine was available, but more often simply discarded. A comfort station's operational efficiency was measured by throughput, how many soldiers could be processed with minimum medical complications. The women themselves were not considered in these calculations except as the medium through which the calculations operated. The Japanese soldiers who used the comfort stations inhabited their own psychological terrain, one shaped by years of imperial propaganda and military indoctrination. They had been raised in a society that venerated the emperor as a living deity and taught that the Japanese people were destined to lead Asia. The Bushido Code, as interpreted by militarists, emphasized absolute obedience, self-sacrifice, and the subordination of individual will to collective purpose. Surrender was shameful. Death in service to the emperor was the highest honor. In this ideological framework, there was little room for empathy toward conquered peoples, and certainly none for women who had been designated as military resources. Diaries and letters from Japanese soldiers reveal a complex picture. Many expressed no moral qualms whatsoever, describing visits to comfort stations in the same casual tone they used to describe meals or card games. Some boasted about their conquests, treating the women as prizes or entertainment, but others revealed discomfort, confusion, even guilt. A 1943 diary entry from a soldier stationed in Burma noted, The woman assigned to me today looked like she might be my sister's age. Her eyes were empty. I could not finish. My comrades mock me for weakness. These moments of doubt were aberrations in a system designed to suppress individual moral judgment. The comfort stations were normalized through routine. They appeared on military maps. Visits were scheduled. Tickets were issued. Literal paper tickets that soldiers purchased or received as rewards. The bureaucratic apparatus transformed rape into a transaction, something regulated and mundane. This normalization was essential to the system's function. If soldiers had been required to see the women as individuals, as human beings with interiority and suffering, the system would have collapsed under the weight of its own horror. Instead, they were taught to see inventory, resources, tools for maintaining combat effectiveness. The women learned to navigate this impossible terrain through whatever means preserved some fragment of self. Some dissociated entirely, describing later how they felt as though they were watching events happen to someone else's body. Others developed elaborate internal worlds, retreating into memories of home or fantasies of escape. A few resisted overtly, refusing to cooperate, attempting to injure soldiers, trying to escape. But these acts usually resulted in severe beatings or death. Most adopted a strategy of minimal compliance, doing what was necessary to survive the day, the hour, the next 15 minutes. What they expected was to die in those stations. By late 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific and Japanese defeat became increasingly likely, the women understood that they represented evidence of war crimes. Japanese command issued evacuation orders for comfort stations in threatened areas, but these orders rarely included provisions for the women themselves. The standard protocol, documented in captured military communications, was elimination. Dispose of comfort women to prevent capture was the euphemistic phrasing. In practice, this meant mass executions. In New Guinea, Australian forces discovered ditches containing the remains of over 70 women, all shot in the back of the head. In Burma, British investigators found charred buildings where women had been locked inside and burned alive. In Okinawa, survivors testified that women were given grenades and told to commit suicide as American troops approached, a fate shared by many Okinawan civilians as well. Some officers carried out these orders with bureaucratic detachment. Others, faced with the reality of mass murder, simply fled, leaving the women locked in buildings or chained in rooms to starve. A smaller number of women survived because the chaos of Japanese retreat created opportunities. Guards abandoned their posts during air raids. Buildings were left unlocked during night evacuations. Some women escaped into jungles or ruins, hiding until they saw American uniforms. Others survived simply because the execution orders arrived too late. American advances were faster than Tokyo had anticipated, overrunning comfort stations before the women inside could be killed. When American soldiers encountered these women, the immediate question was always the same: what do we do? Military training had not prepared them for this. They had been taught infantry tactics, weapons handling, battlefield first aid. They had received lectures about military government and occupation policy. But there was no manual for discovering rooms full of traumatized women who had been systematically raped for years. The response came not from doctrine, but from individual character. In the compound outside Manila, after that initial frozen moment, medics were summoned. Captain John Chen, a Chinese-American medical officer from San Francisco, examined the women with a gentleness that surprised them more than any brutality could have. He worked slowly, explaining each action before he performed it, asking permission even though the women barely responded. Other soldiers brought food: sea rations, canned fruit, chocolate bars. They heated water for washing. They found blankets and clothing. And they did something that, in the context of what the women had experienced, seemed almost incomprehensible. They asked nothing in return. This was the first shock of liberation. The women had learned that men took. That was the fundamental law of their universe for years. Men took, and you survived if you could make yourself small enough, numb enough, absent enough. The concept of men giving, of offering comfort without demanding payment, violated the rules of reality as they understood them. Several women initially refused food, convinced it was poisoned or a prelude to some new violation. One woman wept when a soldier draped a blanket over her shoulders, not from gratitude, but from the sheer disorientation of experiencing a kind gesture from a man in uniform. It was in these early interactions that a pattern began to emerge, one that would repeat across dozens of liberation sites throughout 1945. American soldiers, confronted with the comfort women, consistently referred to them as sisters. The word appears again and again in after-action reports, in letters home, in post-war interviews. It was not official terminology. Military documents used phrases like displaced persons or civilian internees. But on the ground, face-to-face with the women, the soldiers used a different language. Sisters, Private First Class Inouye, standing in that Manila hillside compound, reportedly said to the other soldiers, "These are somebody's sisters. They could be my sisters. Treat them like your own family." The instructions spread through the unit not as an order, but as a shared understanding. When the women were moved to a temporary aid station, the soldiers who escorted them carried their few possessions, walked at their pace, spoke in gentle tones even when language barriers made comprehension impossible. Tone, the women learned, could convey what words could not. The symbolic weight of calling them sisters cannot be overstated. In Japanese military thinking, the comfort women were objects, necessary objects perhaps, but objects nonetheless. They existed in a category separate from humanity, a category that permitted their use and disposal. The American soldiers, by contrast, were asserting kinship. They were drawing a line from these brutalized foreign women directly into their own families, their own moral universe. They were saying, "You belong to the category of people who matter." This was not merely personal sentiment. It reflected a deeper ideological difference, one that manifested in countless small ways throughout the Pacific War. The American soldiers came from a society that, for all its profound contradictions and failures, racial segregation, economic inequality, the internment of Japanese Americans, still operated on premises fundamentally different from Japanese militarism. American civic culture, however imperfectly realized, held that individuals possessed inherent rights, that families were sacred, that women were not property, that human dignity was not contingent on nationality or race. These principles were often honored in the breach. The America of 1945 was a nation where black soldiers fought in segregated units, where women were largely excluded from combat roles and political power, where indigenous peoples remained second-class citizens. But the principles existed, and they exerted pressure. They created a framework within which decent action was possible, even if not always realized. When American soldiers treated the comfort women as sisters, they were drawing on this framework, however unconsciously, however inconsistently. The symbolic object that came to represent this difference was coffee. Not weapons, not technology, but a simple beverage that American forces distributed with almost absurd abundance. The U.S. military supply chain in 1945 was a marvel of industrial capitalism, a logistics network so vast and efficient that frontline troops often had access to luxuries that rear echelon forces in other armies could only dream of. Coffee was ubiquitous. It arrived in such quantities that it was sometimes used wastefully, poured out when it grew cold, brewed strong and black in quantities that defied any reasonable consumption rate. To the comfort women, who had survived on watery rice gruel and occasional scraps, this abundance was almost hallucinatory. The first time many of them tasted American coffee, they did not know what they were drinking. It was bitter and hot and strong, nothing like tea, nothing like anything they had experienced in the stations. Some could not finish it. Others wrapped their hands around the metal cups and simply absorbed the warmth, the solid reality of something freely given. A photograph taken by a Signal Corps photographer in March 1945 captures this moment with accidental poetry. 6 women sit outside a Red Cross tent, each holding a steaming cup. They are wearing donated clothes that do not quite fit, dresses too large, sweaters stretched and faded. Their hair has been washed and cut. They are not smiling, but neither are they cowering. They look directly at the camera with expressions that resist easy interpretation. Exhaustion, certainly. Wariness. But also something else. A tentative emergence from the protective shell that trauma builds around the self. In the background of that photograph, barely visible, is an American soldier leaning against a jeep. He is smoking a cigarette and looking away from the camera, respecting the women's space. His posture is relaxed, unthreatening. This detail, the deliberate maintenance of physical and emotional distance, became a hallmark of how American forces approached the comfort women. They understood, often without explicit instruction, that these women needed safety more than they needed help. That proximity itself could feel like threat. That recovery required the restoration of autonomy, not its replacement with benevolent control. The coffee became a ritual. At aid stations and temporary camps across the Pacific, American soldiers brewed vast quantities and distributed it freely. The women came to associate the smell, dark, bitter, distinctly American, with safety. It was the olfactory opposite of the comfort stations, which had smelled of sweat and fear and the astringent chemicals used in forced medical examinations. Coffee smelled like mornings, like normalcy, like a world where people sat peacefully with hot beverages instead of enduring systematic violation. This symbolic association was not lost on the soldiers themselves. They began to understand that they were offering more than caffeine. They were offering a glimpse of a different way of organizing human society, one based on abundance rather than scarcity, on generosity rather than extraction. The United States in 1945 was producing half the world's manufactured goods. It had achieved a level of material prosperity that made even its military rations the envy of Allied forces. American soldiers routinely discarded food that would have been treasure to Japanese troops. This was the dividend of democratic capitalism, of a system that, whatever its flaws, had learned to generate and distribute wealth on an unprecedented scale. The comfort women noticed this abundance in everything: the thickness of the blankets, the quality of the medical supplies, the sheer quantity of food that arrived daily without fail. One survivor, interviewed in the 1990s, recalled, "I thought the Americans must come from a place where nothing ever runs out, where there is always more. I could not imagine such a place, but I wanted to believe it existed." This belief, that abundance was possible, that scarcity was not the natural human condition, was itself a form of liberation. The Japanese Empire had operated on the assumption that resources were finite and must be seized through military force. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was premised on the idea that Japan's survival required the exploitation of conquered territories. This ideology of scarcity justified every cruelty, every exploitation. If resources are finite and survival is at stake, then human rights become a luxury the nation cannot afford. The American system, by contrast, suggested that abundance could be created rather than merely seized, that prosperity could be shared rather than hoarded, that wealth was not a zero-sum game requiring some to suffer so others could thrive. This was not entirely true, of course. American prosperity was built in part on exploitation of its own labor force and natural resources, on the legacy of slavery and the continued oppression of racial minorities. But the difference was real enough. American abundance was productive rather than purely extractive. It generated surplus rather than merely redistributing scarcity. As more comfort stations were liberated throughout 1945, the scale of the system became apparent. Intelligence officers began documenting what they found, compiling evidence for potential war crimes trials. The testimonies they gathered revealed patterns that confirmed the systematic nature of the abuse. In Korea alone, an estimated 50,000 to 200,000 women had been taken into the system. The numbers varied because Japanese records were incomplete and often destroyed. In China, the numbers were similar or higher. In Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, tens of thousands more. The women's testimonies were remarkably consistent despite vast geographical distances and different circumstances of capture. They described the same bureaucratic processing, the same medical inspections, the same daily quotas of soldiers they were forced to serve. They described the same attempts at psychological control, being told they were serving the emperor, that their sacrifice was noble, that resistance was futile. They described the same pattern of escalating brutality toward the war's end, when it became clear that Japan was losing, and the women represented evidence that must be destroyed. The U.S. military began the process of repatriation, working with the Red Cross and various national governments to return women to their home countries. But this process immediately encountered a terrible complication. Many women did not want to return home. In Korean society, a woman's sexual purity was not merely personal, but familial honor. To return as a comfort woman meant bearing a stigma that would destroy marriage prospects, employment opportunities, and social standing. It would shame not only the woman herself but her entire family. Parents might refuse to acknowledge daughters. Siblings might be unable to marry. The stain was considered indelible. Faced with this reality, many women chose to disappear. They stayed in the Philippines or Japan or wherever they had been liberated, assuming new names and fabricating new histories. They told people they had been factory workers or nurses or refugees. They buried the truth so deep that sometimes they almost convinced themselves it had happened to someone else. A few married American servicemen and emigrated to the United States, where they lived out their lives in suburbs from California to Virginia, never speaking of the war, never explaining the nightmares or the flinching response to unexpected sounds. Others returned home but maintained the fiction of alternative wartime experiences. They carried the truth as a secret wound, never discussing it even with husbands or children. The psychological cost of this enforced silence was immense. Studies of survivors conducted decades later found rates of post-traumatic stress disorder approaching 100%. Depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation were nearly universal. Many women had been rendered sterile by repeated forced abortions or untreated venereal disease. Those who could bear children often struggled with intimacy, with the legacy of trauma inscribed in their bodies and psyches. The Japanese government's response to the emerging evidence was systematic denial. In the immediate post-war period, documents were destroyed on a massive scale. Comfort station buildings were demolished. Records were burned. Witnesses were intimidated into silence. When the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in Tokyo in 1946, the comfort women's system was barely mentioned. Allied prosecutors focused on conventional war crimes: the Bataan Death March, the Burma-Siam Railway, prisoner of war camp atrocities. Sexual slavery did not fit easily into existing frameworks of international law. There was no precedent for prosecuting rape as a war crime on this scale. As a result, the comfort women disappeared from official history. Japanese textbooks made no mention of them. Government officials, when asked, claimed ignorance or denied that the system had been sanctioned by military command. A few soldiers were prosecuted by Dutch authorities for the enslavement of European women in Indonesia, but these cases were exceptions. The vast majority of perpetrators, from the military officers who designed the system to the soldiers who utilized it, faced no legal consequences whatsoever. This impunity would last for nearly half a century. It was not until 1991 that a Korean survivor named Kim Hak-sun publicly testified about her experience, breaking decades of silence and sparking a movement among survivors across Asia. Her testimony, delivered at age 67, was precise and devastating. She described being taken at age 17, the brutal conditions of the stations, the daily rapes, and the decades of shame and silence that followed. Her courage inspired other survivors to come forward, and slowly, painfully, the truth began to emerge into public consciousness. The American soldiers who had liberated the comfort stations largely moved on with their lives, carrying what they had witnessed as private burdens. Some spoke about it with fellow veterans, in the careful language that survivors of trauma use with each other. Oblique, understated, leaving the worst unsaid. Others never mentioned it, filing it away with all the other horrors of war that decent people do not inflict on loved ones through description. But a few felt compelled to testify, to ensure that what they had seen was documented and remembered. Private First-Class Inouye, who had stood in that doorway outside Manila, returned to Hawaii, and eventually entered politics. He rarely discussed the comfort women publicly, but in private conversations with other veterans and civil rights activists, he would reference them as evidence of what happened when a society abandoned the principle that every individual possessed inherent dignity. "When you treat people as things," he reportedly said, "you build a system that consumes everything human about yourself." The Japanese Empire did not fail because it was militarily weak. It failed because it became morally hollow. This analysis pointed toward one of the war's deeper lessons. The Japanese military had possessed brilliant strategists, courageous soldiers, and sophisticated tactics. Its early victories demonstrated formidable capability. But the system it built was unsustainable because it was founded on principles that violated basic human needs and rights. You cannot maintain an empire by brutalizing populations. You cannot generate loyalty through terror. You cannot build prosperity on systematic exploitation without eventually exhausting what you are exploiting. The American system, for all its flaws, operated on different premises. It assumed that prosperity could be expanded rather than merely seized, that governance required some degree of consent from the governed, that individuals possessed rights that even military necessity could not entirely abrogate. These principles were often violated in practice, the internment of Japanese Americans being the most glaring example. But they remained as ideals that exerted pressure on the society, that enabled criticism and reform, that prevented the total corruption of democratic institutions. The comfort women experienced this difference viscerally. They had lived under a system that denied their humanity, and found themselves suddenly in the presence of a system that, however imperfectly, acknowledged it. The transformation was not immediate or complete. Many remained traumatized for life. But the possibility of recovery, of rebuilding an identity not defined solely by victimization, depended on that acknowledgement. When American soldiers called them sisters, they were not erasing what had been done. They were asserting that what had been done did not define the totality of these women's existence, that they remained connected to the human family, that they were owed care and respect not because they had earned it through suffering, but because they were human beings, and human beings matter. The epilogue of this story continues to unfold. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the surviving comfort women became symbols in larger debates about memory, responsibility, and justice. Statues were erected in their honor, often depicting a young woman in traditional dress sitting on a chair, one hand resting on her lap, the other clenched in determination. These statues appeared in Seoul, Manila, San Francisco, Berlin, physical reminders that what happened to these women was real, that it mattered, that it must not be forgotten. The Japanese government's response remained ambiguous. In 1993, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono issued a statement acknowledging that comfort stations were operated in response to the request of the military authorities of the day, and that the recruitment of the comfort women was conducted mainly by private recruiters who acted in response to the request of the military. This was the closest Japan came to an official apology, and it was immediately controversial within Japan, with right-wing politicians arguing that the statement went too far and validated what they considered to be exaggerated or fabricated claims. No comprehensive reparations program was ever established. A private fund created in 1995, the Asian Women's Fund, provided some compensation to survivors, but many refused to accept it because the money came from private donations rather than the Japanese government, which they interpreted as a continued denial of state responsibility. The debate became intensely politicized, with historical facts often subordinated to nationalist narratives and diplomatic considerations. What remained, ultimately, were the testimonies of the survivors themselves. These women, now elderly and facing the end of their lives, dedicated their final decades to ensuring that the truth was told. They sat for interviews, endured cross-examination by skeptics, allowed their private suffering to become public record. They did this not primarily for compensation, though justice demanded it, but for recognition. They wanted the world to acknowledge that what happened to them was real, that it was wrong, and that the systems and ideologies that enabled it must be understood and opposed. In their testimonies, the moment of liberation recurred again and again: the shock of kindness, the disorientation of being treated as human, the sound of American soldiers offering coffee and blankets, and that single, simple word, sisters. These moments did not erase the trauma or undo the years of suffering, but they represented a pivot point, a moment when a different future became possible, when survival could be more than mere biological persistence, when recovery could begin. There is a specific quality to the silence that follows great atrocity. It is not the silence of peace, but the silence of things left unsaid, truths too painful to voice, memories too dangerous to surface. The comfort women lived in this silence for decades, carrying histories that they could not share without risking their own destruction. The silence was imposed not just by personal trauma, but by social structures that valued a woman's chastity over her testimony, national pride over historical accuracy, social harmony over individual justice. The American soldiers who liberated them disrupted this silence, even if only temporarily. They created a space, however brief and fragile, where the women could be seen as more than their suffering, where what had been done to them could be named, if not yet fully addressed, where the machinery of atrocity could be documented and witnessed, even if justice remained distant. The coffee they shared, that simple, abundant, bittersweet beverage, became the symbol of this possibility. It represented a world where there was enough, where scarcity was not the defining condition of human existence, where generosity was possible because prosperity was real, where a soldier could give a cup of coffee to a traumatized woman and ask nothing in return, because the asking itself was recognized as obscene, as a continuation of the very exploitation that had brought her to this moment. This is the enduring lesson of the comfort women's liberation, that how we treat the most vulnerable among us reveals the truth about our systems and ourselves. The Japanese Empire built its expansion on extraction and brutality, and it collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. The American system, flawed and contradictory as it was, operated on premises that allowed for mercy, for the recognition of shared humanity across lines of nation and race. It was not perfect. It did not prevent all suffering, but it created possibilities that the totalitarian alternative had foreclosed. The women who survived carried this knowledge in their bodies and memories. They had lived under both systems. They knew the difference between being treated as inventory and being called a sister. They knew the difference between a world of imposed scarcity and one of imperfect abundance. And in their final years, as they testified and demanded recognition, they insisted that the world remember this difference, that it honor their suffering not through pity, but through commitment to the principles that had made their liberation possible. The belief that every individual possesses inherent worth, that systems exist to serve people rather than the reverse, and that abundance, material, moral, and spiritual, is not a fantasy, but an achievement, hard-won and requiring constant defense. When the last survivor passes, as inevitably she will, what will remain is the record, the testimonies, the documents, the photographs of women sitting outside Red Cross tents, holding cups of American coffee, their faces registering the slow, painful dawn of possibility. These images remind us that history is not merely a sequence of events, but a battleground where competing visions of human existence contend. That the choice between systems matters, not abstractly but in the lived reality of actual human beings. That freedom, abundance, and dignity are not luxuries but necessities, worth defending because their absence creates hells like the comfort stations, and their presence creates moments like liberation, when a soldier can look at a brutalized woman and see not an object or an enemy, but a sister. In the end, they were speechless not because they lacked words, but because the words they knew had been insufficient to capture what they experienced. The shock of cruelty giving way to the shock of kindness, the disorientation of moving from a world that denied their humanity to one that acknowledged it. the tentative stirrings of hope in soil poisoned by years of systematic horror. That silence, heavy with all it could not express, was the sound of a world being unmade and remade, one small gesture at a time, by people who understood that how you treat the vulnerable is how you treat the truth. And the truth, painful and necessary, is that we are all sisters and brothers in this experiment of human civilization, bound by obligations we ignore at our collective peril, called to build systems worthy of our highest ideals rather than monuments to our darkest capabilities.